I will now be talking about config maps. Configuration parameters that are not secret, not like credentials, can be put in a config map. The input is again a key value pair. Just like credentials, you had username, password, here we have another key value pair. The config map key value pairs can be read by the app using environment variables again. Also, you can use container command line arguments in the pod configuration or using volumes. A config map can also contain full configuration files, where the value is actually a configuration file and not just a short string. For instance, a full configuration file can be a web server configuration file. This file can then be mounted using volumes where the application expects its config file. This way, you can inject configuration settings into containers without changing the container itself. Just imagine that you want to use the Nginx container and you of course want to change the configuration, and then you inject that configuration file as a volume in that image. You didn't change the image at all, just the configuration file is different, and you can run any container with the configuration that you want. To generate a config map using files where you first put your data in a file, you can use the following commands. This command will just get the data that you write on the terminal and then put it in app properties until you write the letters EOF. So here we have driver equals JDBC, database equals Postgres, and so on. This is a properties file, key value pairs, and this file we're going to read using kubectl create config map. We're going to call it app.config, and we're going to say from file app.properties, and then you have a config map. This is just a very simple config map where you just have very short strings. You don't really have a configuration file, but you could also use a configuration file, and that's what I'm going to show you during the demo. How do you use a config map then? You can create a pod that exposes a config map using a volume. Here we have a pod, still our Kubernetes demo, still container port 3000. We have volume mounts. The name is config volume and the mount path is etc config. So we're going to mount a volume in etc config. The volume itself is just referring to this config map that we used earlier. And then the config values will be stored in files. You will have, for instance, from the previous one, etc config driver, and then the value will be in that file. You can also use hierarchy. If you would use dots in the name, then you can have param.with.hierarchy. Then that translates into param as a directory, with as a directory, and hierarchy as a file with the value in. So you can also create hierarchy in your config map. Here is the same example of a pod that exposes the config map as environment variables. You can use env, name, you can say for instance driver, value from, so this is exactly the same as what we did with credentials, but then we have config map key reference rather than the reference from our credentials. You pass the name and a key, and then the value of this environment variable driver will be the value of the config map of the key driver. In the next demo, I'm going to show you how this works using a configuration file. We're going to run an Nginx in front of our pod demo. We are basically going to run a reverse proxy, and we need to update the configuration file for that. That's why we need ConfigMap.